In 1897, Vienna became the host city to a cultural revolution. That year, 40 artists broke away from the established artists' house to set up a bold new institution of their own, the Vienna Secession. These were the painters and sculptors of the Avant-Garde, full of new ideas about visual art. They wanted to break down the barriers between art and craft. They sought a suggestive, psychological impact in their work. The artists of the Secession brought Vienna into the exciting world of end-of-the-century European art, and they were led by a painter recognized as a giant of the age, Gustav Klimt. Klimt was, and remains, an enigmatic figure. He rarely revealed his innermost thoughts. He was described as moody and taciturn, a monk-like figure, permanently clad in his blue artist's smock. For Klimt, it was his art that revealed his identity as a man, and his pictures are now recognized as masterpieces of the age. Gustav Klimt's artistic career started early on. Even as a student, he received valuable commissions. We can still admire the striking naturalism of his early works. But his greatest achievements were created later in his life, after a long and deliberate artistic evolution. Bejeweled, decorative, powerfully erotic. It is for these unprecedented pictures that Gustav Klimt is globally famous today.
What I enjoy most about Klimt is his sensuality, his colour, his decorative effects, which he achieved through using several different traditions of art: Indian art, European art, and Eastern art.
I think superficially it would be the pattern, surface pattern of his work, the fact that he involves surface pattern, he uses surface pattern, which was quite unusual. But I think what I respond to is the fact he didn't follow any particular trend. He was his own man, and was therefore, and because of that, he was not recognised, and it's only comparatively recently that actually he's been recognised as a major figure.
Klimt was born on the 14th of July, 1862, close to the city that would be his lifelong home. His father worked in Vienna as a goldsmith and engraver, and he was keen for his sons to become craftsmen like himself. One of Klimt's brothers did become a goldsmith, but the young Gustav displayed a wider artistic talent. At the age of 14, along with his brother Ernst, he was enrolled in the Vienna School of the Applied Arts. This was a newly founded institution offering a curriculum far broader than that on offer at the established Academy of Fine Art. The Klimt brothers learnt the techniques of mosaic and fresco. They studied the history of design, and in the classes of Professor Ferdinand Laufberger, they were schooled in the art of decorative painting. Away from their formal studies, they also took time to learn the art of portraiture by copying from photographs. Long before leaving the Academy in 1883, Gustav and Ernst Klimt were securing commissions and making money as artists. Shortly after completing his formal studies, Gustav Klimt set up his own studio in Vienna, along with his brother and an Academy friend, Franz Matsch. That year, Klimt completed this commission for a published series of paintings entitled Allegories and Emblems. Here we see a conventional neoclassical image, very different from his famous pictures of later life. But this is also a highly competent painting for a young man fresh from school. Commissioned works like these proved valuable for Klimt and his colleagues. In 1886, their studio received an even greater task: to decorate the ceiling and staircases for Vienna's opulent new theatre, the new Burgtheater. Theatre itself provided the subject matter for the work. Here we see Gustav Klimt's depiction of a performance of Romeo and Juliet in the famous Globe Theatre of Shakespeare's time. The Burgtheater decorations also included this image of the antique theatre in Taormina, a work revealing Klimt's interest in classical themes. This fascination with the classical stayed with Klimt throughout his life.
He was trained as a classical artist, had to go along to the museums and galleries and copy classical casts. And the most important artist in Vienna in the 80s and 90s, called Makart, used classical subjects. In fact, all the academies in Europe used classical subjects, and Klimt had to come to grips with that if he was going to be successful, which he wanted to be.
Klimt's early works also reveal a striking ability to depict the human face. In his Shakespearean decoration at the Burgtheater, Klimt wears a giant ruff alongside his two studio colleagues. By this stage, his years of copying photographs were now proving to be especially valuable. The Burgtheater decorations won his studio a prize from the Austrian emperor himself. Shortly afterwards, Klimt received a further commission with a theatrical subject. He was asked to paint the audience gathered for a performance at Vienna's Old Burgtheater. The result was a virtual snapshot of Viennese society in the late 1880s. Entitled The Auditorium of the Old Burgtheater, this is a small work executed in opaque colours mixed with water, gum and honey, the medium of gouache. It was a huge undertaking. When news of the commission spread, the leading lights of Viennese society beat a path to the artist's door, desperate to be included in the scene. It's believed that Klimt produced no less than 1,500 preparatory sketches before completing the picture. The painting was rapturously received. In 1890, the very same work earned Gustav Klimt the Emperor's Prize.
As a painting, I don't think it's a particularly great achievement at all. As an exercise in publicity, it was absolutely brilliant. Because all the socialites in Vienna wanted to be in the painting, he became very well known.
Reminds us very much of some of the Academy paintings, for instance in the Royal Academy, where everyone wants to be in it. The private view at the Royal Academy by Frith is a good example.
The success of the auditorium painting made Gustav Klimt a famous figure in Vienna, and his studio was soon commissioned to carry out another large decoration for the History of Art Museum. Klimt's task was to decorate the wall spaces between the pilaster columns with figures drawn from art history. When completed, the result was an intriguing series of portraits following a journey from ancient Egypt through classical times to the Italian Renaissance. Klimt's near-photographic depictions of human facial features are startling. His emphasis on female subjects permeated his life's works. Klimt's use of gold as part of his decorative colour scheme became a feature of much of his radical later work. Many viewers of the museum decorations are also struck by the strikingly modern appearance of many of his female figures. But these are still orthodox paintings. When Klimt completed the decorations in 1891, he was still working in the established naturalist tradition of the time. But things were about to change, both in the artist's personal life and in the wider society of his home city. It would lead to a revolution in the art of Gustav Klimt. In 1892, Klimt's life was turned upside down. His father died, shortly followed by the deaths of his brother and studio colleague. It appears that Klimt was plunged into gloom by this double tragedy. He was, however, supported by his sister-in-law, Emilie Floge, as well as Vienna's cultural community. It was an exciting time to move in artistic circles. From 1890 onwards, an avant-garde movement began to flourish in Vienna. In literature, and later in art, a reaction developed against what was seen as the restrictions of naturalism.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
Intellectuals began to argue for a more suggestive, symbolic art that would express the deeper truths of the human condition. Gustav Klimt moved widely in avant-garde circles, and it was against this background that his work began to change.
In the early 90s, the younger painters in Vienna wanted to have access to more European art. They wanted to bring it into Vienna to be exhibited, which was not allowed at that time. And they also wanted to be able to exhibit their own art in other European venues.
And I think it's that restriction, which was the thing that any young artist coming through clearly wanted to be able to voice their own views. And this was not allowed. And indeed, they were simply not accepted. So in that sense, I think that generally, including Klimt, there was a general, as there often is, a revolt against the establishment.
In the early years of the 1890s, Gustav Klimt spent more and more time in the Viennese coffee houses, surrounded by avant-garde ideas, which found their way into his work. As early as 1890, Klimt painted a portrait of the pianist Joseph Pembar. The full meaning of the strange classical images in the framing is still debated today. Klimt's incorporation of the lyre can be interpreted as an allusion to harmony, as expressed through the notion of the tuned string. This was an important idea of Greek antiquity, reflecting the artist's enduring fascination with the ancients. And again, the lyre features in his 1895 canvas. Klimt painted music for the first time in 1895, a far cry from his earlier naturalism.
There is quite an element of allusion to Greek, archaic, Egyptian. And of course that ties in with his liking for a wide variety of academic art, including, for instance, in this country, Alma Tadema. But at the same time, the composition is going a bit wayward. It's going asymmetrical. It's going around to the edges. And it is including, and this is where we begin to see this surface decoration coming in.
Klimt started to move towards the flat, frieze-like composition that characterized much of his greatest work. His use of gold reached new heights.
He liked the ornamentation, of course, the decorative effects, and of course his father was a goldsmith, so he'd had some training early on in life in goldsmithing.
But gold does seem to have emerged at this stage at Music One as something which we can quite clearly see as he began to develop and work on. And of course, later on, other inspiration came to him from other sources which added to that.
By the time this sketch was completed in 1895, Gustav Klimt was moving towards the art of his maturity. The same year, he painted this memorable canvas, a representation of love. The image crackles with passion, with the sensation enhanced by the golden framing device. But it is also an attempt to convey something more than just the joy of love. Positioned above the embrace are bizarre female heads, symbols of the ages of womanhood. The presence of this terrible old hag looking down from the sky is a reminder that passionate love has its darker side.
It's his, if you like, fascination, if not obsession, with woman. And you can link that, of course, with the whole business of the rise of the science of psychology and the whole business of sexual ethics and that. And we see here what emerges much later on, an ambivalent attitude towards women. Because you have got a painting here, mysterious, dark, ill-defined.
Unlike the Music One, which was done at the same time, it actually has quite a lot of symbolism in. The actual focus of the picture is on the two romantic people about to kiss. Fairly traditional, conventional. The man is very brown, the woman's very pale. She has her head lifted up in a traditional female submissive role.
We've got at the top of the painting the three ages of woman, very young, maturity and old age. And that is a theme which he comes to time and time again. It's very depressing, and I think a lot of his work can be seen to be very depressing, and I think that's also a reason why there's been an ambivalent attitude towards him.
Klimt was well aware of the ambiguous nature of eroticism. His enthusiasm to convey this message landed him in trouble, and he was condemned as little more than a pornographer. But when this canvas was completed in 1895, Gustav Klimt was still seen by many as the master of neoclassical decorative projects. That reputation secured him a commission to paint the ceiling of the Great Hall of Vienna's university. But the mammoth commission sparked the greatest controversy of his career. When the first fruits of his labour were revealed in 1901, the university authorities were outraged by the uncompromising boldness of his work. But they should not have been surprised. By the end of the 19th century, Klimt had become identified with everything radical in Viennese art, the Vienna Secession. In 1891, Klimt had been elected to the Künstlerhaus, the artist's house that dominated the Viennese art scene. This established institution owned the only exhibition hall in Vienna. Painters who wanted their work exposed to any sort of audience found themselves forced to compromise their art to fall in with the academic style of painting favoured by the Künstlerhaus. Creative suffocation was not an unusual phenomenon at the time. It had been seen before elsewhere in Europe. French art was formerly dominated by the academic philosophy of the Paris Salon. But in 1874, the artists who became known as the Impressionists broke the stranglehold forever with the first of their historic independent exhibitions. But elsewhere in Europe, the old traditionalism lived on. In the Vienna of the early 1890s, paintings in the Impressionist style were still excluded from the Künstlerhaus exhibition. Eventually, the city's most liberal artists revolted. In 1897, 40 of them decided to form their own independent institution, with Gustav Klimt as its first president. This was the birth of the Vienna Secession.
The Vienna Secession, as it's called, is something which was really part of the spirit of the age. In Austria and Germany, for instance, in 1892, there was a secession at Munich. The Viennese Secession was 1897, and then there was in Berlin in 1899. So in other words, it wasn't peculiar to Vienna, it was part of the spirit of the age.
The artists in Vienna, the younger artists, were dissatisfied with the lack of choice in their exhibiting venues and the lack of European input into their exhibitions. And this is why Klimt and a few others decided to set up their own group, which could have been accepted, of course, by the academic circles, but they didn't accept it. They criticised it heavily. So during that particular meeting, in fact, where they criticised it, Klimt and his friends left, and then they had to be independent.
The founders of the secession were keen to show the Viennese public that art had moved on from the stuffy academic approach favoured by the Künstlerhaus leadership. In 1898, the first secession exhibition took place. The venue was a dedicated building strongly influenced by the contemporary spirit of Art Nouveau.
It's quite interesting that they had a great deal of backing, actually, because, for instance, they had a new building built for their secession. And that must have caused, they must have had tremendous amount of backing there. And that in itself was a symbol of the new ideas in architecture.
We can also see the characteristic curving lines of Art Nouveau in this poster designed by Klimt to promote the first secession event.
Art Nouveau was a European movement, but the Austrians would have known mostly about the English manifestation of Mackintosh and his wife, and Aubrey Beardsley and Whistler. And what they liked about it was the symbolism, for a start, and the emphasis on design, the sinuous movements, natural forms. It was the antithesis of realism, really. It was something artificial, something exciting, something that you could read deeper meanings into.
I'm reminded of something which is very peculiarly European and, for someone like Hogarth, peculiarly English. That is what Hogarth said in his analysis of beauty in the middle of the 18th century, was the line of beauty, which was a sinuous, shallow S. And if you look at that, the sinuous, shallow S is something which is very, very much part of the Art Nouveau. And I think it was tapping into something which was, if you like, pre-Renaissance, the Art Nouveau was, and yet was absolutely modern, and was breaking down this barrier between the arts and the crafts.
The Vienna Secession took the city by storm, with the first exhibition attracting almost 60,000 visitors. They were able to enjoy works by artists from abroad, as well as the best new Viennese talent. And the works on show were not restricted to paintings. Sculptures, graphic works and drawings were all shown, breaking down the barriers between fine and applied arts. Klimt moved into graphic work with his exhibition poster and with an illustration for the Secession's own magazine, The Sacred Spring. But at the second secession event, late in 1898, it was a Klimt oil painting that made the biggest impact. This is Pallas Athene, the Greek goddess of wisdom and the arts. The figure is not instantly recognizable. The image is primarily one of the erotic, literally dripping with golden, seductive power. The provocative nature of Pallas Athene incensed some critics, who referred to it as the demon of the secession. The barbed comments of the critics did not worry Klimt. He was fully committed to his own agenda, as the canvas The Naked Truth shows. The depiction of pubic hair was a bold move in 1899, but the quote in the frame above could be more significant still. Taken from the work of the great German dramatist Schiller, it makes the artist's message clear. Great art is created by the few for the benefit of the few.
Here we get a work which smacks you in the face, really, and it smacked the people in the face at the time. It's really a full frontal nude, which was shocking. It was regarded as shocking, because here he was moving away from the classicism, the decent classicism of Alma Tadema, of Henry Moore in this country, of classical artists, academic artists at the Salon in Paris. It's if a woman's body was draped with something which looked vaguely classical, with a few convenient classical pillars behind, then it was decent. But as Manny had found at the beginning of the 19th century, if you do a painting of a woman facing you, looking at you, who is contemporary, that is at the present, then that's shocking, that's terrible.
The themes and techniques of Naked Truth became recurring features of Klimt's work. But at the time the painting was completed, the artist was engaged with other, very different projects. Around 1898, he began to create the first of his many landscape pictures. In 1900, Klimt created an amazing canvas depicting the great Viennese composer Schubert at the piano. One critic claimed it was the greatest Austrian painting ever. Sadly, This haunting, impressionistic image was destroyed during the Second World War. The Second World War later claimed the most controversial works of his career, his ceiling paintings for the Great Hall of Vienna University. Although this major commission was issued in 1894, it was only in 1900, at a Secession exhibition, that Klimt first revealed his university work. His task was to paint 3 large allegorical paintings depicting philosophy, medicine, and jurisprudence. In 1900, he displayed his unfinished painting of philosophy. The result sparked outrage. The university authorities had expected a recognizable celebration of reason and wisdom. What they got was something very different.
There was no ordered sort of classical composition of figures which were easily seen as representing, in this case, philosophers, Aristotle, Socrates, or whatever. It was a vague bunching of figures, basically, they regarded it as. And they revolted. Something like 87 professors of the various departments were up in arms and wrote letters, the equivalent of writing to the Times, complaining about the vision was unclear, the figures were unclear, the concept was unclear. It seemed to be unclear is what they were on about. You could see what they were meaning in one sense. That didn't seem to get them very far, the academics. This thing was still going ahead. And so they got it raised in Parliament, and so there was a parliamentary debate about this. And by 1905, the saga was dragged on for that length of time. Klimt himself didn't wish any more to be compromised and decided to withdraw from the commission altogether.
No less than 87 university professors condemned the work, and a similar reaction greeted the remaining paintings in the university series. In 1901, medicine was seen as illustrating the power of disease more than that of medicinal advances, and the so-called Klimt affair was debated in the Austrian parliament. The final painting, Jurisprudence, was also widely criticised. The surviving photograph reveals a painting of the harshest, most unforgiving brand of justice. Sadly, the loss of all 3 of these huge canvases in a 1945 fire means that contemporary audiences will never be able to appreciate the terror of the original work. In the end, Klimt grew tired of the whole university affair and bought back his paintings from the Ministry of Culture. Annoyed by the conservative reaction to his work, he hit back in a 1902 canvas entitled Goldfish. Klimt originally considered calling the work To My Critics. The proposed title suggests a mischievous nature, but little is known about the character of Gustav Klimt. His personality is assessed purely on the basis of his art, and the early 20th century saw him put his public controversies behind him whilst he created some of the greatest images of his career. He continued to create major allegorical works such as the so-called Beethoven frieze, a reinterpretation of the composer's legendary Ninth Symphony, the choral symphony that concludes with the power of love celebrated in The Kiss to the Whole World from the Ode to Joy. Klimt also maintained a busy schedule of portraiture and increasingly landscape. Every summer he left Vienna to stay with his mistress at her family home in the country. There he painted canvases like this image of fruit trees, and in 1902 this beech grove. The strong sense of decorative pattern can almost be seen as a precursor to the abstract expressionism of the later 20th century. Modern audiences can imagine the landscape could be infinitely extended if we wished. A sense made stronger by the artist's recurring use of the square canvas.
Well, he was quite articulate about this, and he said that this format makes it possible to bathe the subject in an atmosphere of peace. Though through the square, the picture becomes part of a universal whole. So he sees the square as being able to be extended indefinitely in any direction, and it is a universal shape. It's also quite unconventional, and he probably liked that.
There's an analysis here, a defining, if you like, defining a design problem of which the square is part. And the square, of course, as one appreciates, was something which became very much, very important, whether it be to the constructivists and supremists like Malevich, or indeed to people like Braque and Picasso. The square seemed to be something with which they're working as a deliberate design problem. I certainly see Klimt as deliberately defining the square through which, or within which, the trees are then orchestrated.
Klimt's summers in the countryside enabled him to indulge his enthusiasm for landscape painting. They also gave him time with his mistress, Emilie Floge. Though they never married, Gustav and Emilie remained together for some 27 years. And in 1902, she was the subject of one of the most significant works of Klimt's career. This was the first time that Gustav Klimt combined a naturalistic depiction of human hands and face with a flat, bejeweled, decorative manner. It was not the last.
It's as if he's been mulling this over. He's got to know her very well indeed, becomes, if you like, part of her. And out comes, it's an outpouring of his realism in this sense of feeling. It is not of the tame delineation again of the external surface. It's getting at the soul and the spirit of the person. And it's, if you like, reduced down to the face and the hands as being very naturalistic, at least in the sense that you know exactly what they are, and they are the primary point of interest. You go straight to them. And yet they are contained and set within this almost amorphous, vivid pattern, colour, shape, which is not defined in the same sense. And so you're getting the soul of the person being part of its surroundings. The reality is more than the external appearance. This is what Klimt is getting at.
With this canvas, Klimt moved closer to a full-scale aestheticism in his work. The painting to be appreciated as a painting and as nothing else, and its impact upon the viewer remains stunning. The flat, highly patterned approach would dominate his later portraiture, with canvases like Fritze Reidler from 1906, and this dazzling image of Adele Bloch-Bauer, completed the following year. By this time, Klimt had virtually given up painting male portraits. He found no shortage of female sitters in wealthy Viennese society. But the artist possessed an ambiguous opinion of womanhood. Like many others at the time, he saw both the beautiful and the erotic in the feminine condition. Woman as both goddess and temptress. And it is the latter characteristic that we see in this astonishing canvas depicting the biblical figure of Judith. Judith is almost a monument to the destructive potential of female temptation.
Here we get, if you like, the archetypal femme fatale. We've got woman temptress, seductress, destroyer. It's again telling us something about Klimt and his attitude to women, or rather his reaction to women.
The model for this painting was Adele Bloch-Bauer, who was thought to be one of his mistresses, so there was an intimate connection there. And he portrays her in a state of ecstasy, which is not really so surprising since she's just cut off the head of the leader of the Assyrian army, which is what she actually wanted to do, but it could be interpreted as sexual ecstasy rather than triumph at having achieved something.
Again, It's the use of the surface decoration, it's the use of tactile, sensuous, sensual colour and form, and yet the focus on the face, the facial features. The slight tilting of the head gives a sort of dominance, a domination, which is all part and parcel of this. It's a terrific work.
Gustav Klimt lived in an age when the power of human sexuality itself was being revealed through the works of his fellow Viennese, Sigmund Freud. No one knows for certain if both men met, but there is arguably a Freudian element in his canvas. It is said that Klimt was possessed of a strong sexual drive. One wealthy young lady described how the artist followed her to Venice in a fruitless attempt to win her love. The sheer eroticism of much of Klimt's later work does suggest a Freudian attempt to triumph over personal neurosis, the so-called path back to reality. The artist's lifelong reluctance to talk about his artistic inspiration only adds to the neurotic suspicion. There is also evidence that his working days followed an almost regimented routine, and apart from his summer holidays with Emilie Floge, he hardly left Vienna at all. But in 1903, at the age of 41, Gustav Klimt did venture further afield when he travelled to Italy on 2 occasions. He was not the first to make such a journey. For centuries, artists from Northern and Central Europe had made an Italian trip to see for themselves the greatest artistic achievements of antiquity and the Renaissance. But Klimt's journeys south had a very different purpose. His destination was not Rome, Florence or Venice, but the city of Ravenna, to see the finest achievements in an art form from outside the Western tradition. Mosaic. It was the beginning of the artist's so-called golden period.
Klimt went to Ravenna in 1903 and he saw the Basilica of San Vitale, which is full of the most amazing mosaics. And of course the mosaics are made up of small stones and gold and reflect the light in a particular way, which he was completely entranced by, and it was this that he brought back with him from Ravenna. His interest in gold is to do with his father being a goldsmith and the fact that it's a reflective metallic surface which is exciting and contrasts with paint or with semi-precious stones very nicely. And it gives a sense of luxury, of course, which is something that his Viennese clients were particularly interested in.
During the middle years of the 20th century's first decade, the artist's use of gold could be little short of overwhelming. Increasingly, a greater degree of abstraction revealed itself in golden period paintings like Water Serpents from 1907. With this picture, the artist has turned his erotic attentions to the business of lesbian love, as the influence of mosaic patterning can be seen all around the ecstatic couple. The kiss provided further ammunition for his critics seeking a pornographic inspiration behind Klimt's work. But with the most famous painting of the artist's career, it is difficult not to appreciate the artist's achievement in purely artistic terms. This 1908 image features the artist's trademark love of gold, his use of mosaic decoration, his fascination with beauty, the erotic and the act of the embrace. The title is simply The Kiss, and it is, for many, the greatest achievement of Gustav Klimt's career.
The kiss is about that moment when two people become close to each other, physically close, emotionally close, and at the point of a kiss you are not conscious of your surroundings in any defined way. It's something so very personal, and it's this magical use of form, shape, pattern
In some ways it's very traditional, of course, as well, because the man is taller and clasping the woman who is looking up to him. It's very touching as well in the way that they relate to each other. Her hands are very expressive, for example. Of course, it also has a symbolism in it, because the decorations on the woman's garments are rounded, circular, and so on, whereas the man has square decorations, more angular, which two different symbolisms for the different sexes.
It is the shape of the two heads together, surrounded by what emotionally one feels but doesn't see, and that seems to me what's important. It is an extremely powerful work. Disturbing, yes, and I think only comparatively recently, as I say, taste been able to actually face up to it.
The Kiss was first shown in public at a major exhibition in 1908, and the value of the work was immediately recognised. It was purchased by the National Gallery of Austria, and Klimt's fame was now assured. But Viennese art was once again changing. The Secession had divided into two groups, the so-called realists, who favoured a more traditional painterly technique, and Klimt's stylists, who favoured the decorative approach. Klimt's artistic friends included Oskar Kokoschka and the young Egon Schiele, and it was these artists who came to be seen as the real pioneers of the Viennese avant-garde. As Gustav Klimt approached 50 years of age, it appears that he felt the need to seek out new influences for his work. At a 1909 exhibition, he experienced the works of Vincent van Gogh. His admiration for the Dutchman can arguably be detected in landscape pictures like a canvas from 1912. 1909 also saw Klimt leave Vienna on one of his rare departures from the city. He travelled to Paris, where he developed a taste for the work of another great post-impressionist, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. The portrait of a lady in a hat with a feather boa could almost be seen as a homage to the French master. But Gustav Klimt also continued to produce work in his own inimitable style. Eroticism and female sexuality continued as thematic concerns, as in The Virgin of 1913. But when the artist was commissioned to paint this portrait of the young Mada Primavera, he proved that his flat, decorative approach could capture the innocence of girlhood as well as the ambiguous spirit of adult woman. But by the early 1910s, it is said that Klimt was a tired-looking man. If so, there was good reason. For many years he had been engaged in the laborious production of his final masterpiece, and it had been a hugely ambitious project. Only in 1911, after 6 years of labour, was the work complete. This was the Stoclet Palace frieze. In 1904, a millionaire in the city of Brussels decided to commission a complete work of art, a great building where every component was part of an artistic whole. To carry out the work, he commissioned a splinter group from the Vienna Secession, the Viennese Workshop. The architect was Joseph Hoffmann, and the artist responsible for the decoration of the dining room was Gustav Klimt.
The Stoclet Palace summed up, really, what the Vienna Workhouse aimed at. It was a combination of architecture and interior decoration, including paintings and mosaics and sculpture. And Klimt did the dining room, and he did mosaics on 3 of the walls. And they were really the climax of his interior decorative projects.
The Stoclet Palace decorations gave Klimt the chance to work in the medium of mosaic, and the result was a triumph. On the long walls of the palace dining room, he created the huge swirling image of the Tree of Life. On the other walls, 2 more symbolic images, this fulfillment and, perhaps greatest of all, expectation. The influence of Byzantine mosaic, a mastery of decorative pattern, and above all, Klimt's famous concern with the erotic make it a masterpiece that rewards the patient viewer. The Stoclet Palace decorations represent the final great achievement in the art of Gustav Klimt. Though he was not yet 50 when the friezes were installed in 1911, he had less than 7 years to live. In his final years, he continued to paint with an increasing emphasis on his landscape work. But on the 11th of January 1918, Gustav Klimt suffered a catastrophic stroke. 4 weeks later, he was dead. But the majority of his work survives. In the course of a remarkable and controversial career, Klimt moved away from the naturalist painting of which he was a master. Instead, he pursued an art that was far more enigmatic, leaving the city of Vienna speechless with admiration. Although the meanings of his greatest works are still disputed, the value of the art of Gustav Klimt cannot be in doubt.
Klimt's achievement is enduring popularity, actually. And this must be because he deals with themes of constant interest to people, like love and sexuality and sensuality. I think it must be the luxury of his works, perhaps, as well as the subject matter, which continues to appeal to our materialistic age.
He links with some odd characters like Aubrey Beardsley, for instance, in this country. I think he brings together a number of people which don't fit into categories. He constantly moves between what we've subsequently thought of as the figurative and non-figurative abstract, plus a touch of realism. He is vital, he's part of the spirit of the age, and I think we've got a lot to learn about him as yet.